In this video, we're going to be looking at equilibrium price. This video is going to put together what we've learnt from the videos on supply and demand. Specifically, we're going to be looking at how the interaction between these two market forces determines equilibrium prices. In previous videos, we've tackled market demand and market supply separately. But obviously, markets only work through interactions between supply and demand, and this is the topic of this video. To recap, the law of demand states that ceteris paribus, as the price of a good goes up, quantity demanded of that good falls. In other words, there is a negative correlation between the price of a good and quantity demanded of that good. The law of supply states that ceteris paribus, as the price of a good goes up, quantity supplied of that good increases. And so there is a positive correlation between the price of a good and quantity supplied of that good. There are two main building blocks of any market: consumers, who form the demand for a good, and suppliers, who form the supply of a good. Markets function when there are buyers and sellers willing to interact to exchange goods for other goods, as is the case with barter, or simply goods for money. The price and quantity of goods sold in a market are determined by the intersection point of supply and demand. This is also known as the market equilibrium point. We can show why this market equilibrium point holds by looking at either side of the equilibrium price P star. Above the equilibrium price, let's say it's some price P1, we have a market disequilibrium. This is where market supply does not equal market demand. In this case, supply is greater than demand, as the high prices incentivize suppliers to produce more, but the high prices also make the good less affordable and attractive for consumers. In other words, we have a surplus of goods in the market. Clearly, suppliers don't want to have stock left over after everyone who has wanted to and has been able to buy the good has already done so. This pushes the price down in a bid to encourage demand, down to the equilibrium point. Now let's look under the equilibrium price at some point P2. At this price, the good in question is cheap enough so that demand is very high, but too cheap for many producers to justify producing the good. And this leads to another disequilibrium, in this case a shortage, where demand outstrips supply. In this case, the good in question becomes more scarce, and this pushes its price up to the equilibrium price where the shortage no longer exists. Looking at these two scenarios uncovers a major characteristic of market equilibria, and this is that the market equilibrium point is the point at which a market will tend to in the long term, given the absence of rigidities that may prevent the smooth operation and functioning of the market. We can explain changes in market equilibria as a result of supply or demand factors, and these factors shift either supply or demand or both. For example, if the demand for a good increases from D1 to D2, then given no changes in the supply of the good, this will lead to a shift in the market equilibria from point A to point B. And this leads to an increase in the equilibrium price from P1 to P2, and an increase in the equilibrium quantity from Q1 to Q2. As we can see on the second diagram, the opposite is true if the demand curve shifts inward from D1 to D2. You can refer back to my video on demand to uncover why we see shifts in the demand curve. Equally, shifts in the supply curve can lead to changes in market equilibria. For example, if the supply of a good increases, leading to an outward shift in the supply curve from S1 to S2, this will lead to a shift in the equilibrium point from point A to point B. This will increase the equilibrium quantity from Q1 to Q2, but will lead to a fall in the equilibrium price from P1 to P2. And similarly, the opposite is true for cases where the supply of a good falls, leading to an inward shift in the supply curve from S1 to S2. The two previous slides assumed that either the demand curve shifted or the supply curve shifted, whilst the other curve remained constant. But in real life, this is not always the case. Sometimes we see shifts in both supply and demand at the same time. These four diagrams show all the possible combinations of supply and demand shifts. You can see that in all cases, the change in the market equilibrium point leads to a definite change in one of equilibrium price or equilibrium quantity, and an uncertain change in the other variable. This is because, although in all four of these cases, it's easy to tell in a general sense how one of equilibrium price or equilibrium quantity would change, the effect on the other variable is unknown, unless we know how much supply and demand have shifted. In essence, we just need more information about the size of the demand and supply shifts before we can conclude whether this unknown variable would increase or decrease. Try playing around with large and small shifts of both the supply and demand curves, and you'll understand what I mean here. As mentioned previously, it's possible to get instances where we have excess supply or excess demand in the market, and this leads to market disequilibrium. Short-term market disequilibria occur all the time. In fact, whenever we see changes in demand or supply in a market, they are often accompanied by market disequilibria, as it takes time for prices to change in response to the changes in supply or demand. However, these are very quickly corrected in markets unaffected by market rigidities. But this means that markets that are affected by such rigidities often feature disequilibria that stay into the long term. There are three main causes of market disequilibria: government intervention, non-profit maximizing motives, and sticky prices. Firstly, government price controls such as minimum or maximum prices can lead to market surpluses and market shortages respectively, as shown on these two diagrams. Examples of such government controls include the minimum price on alcohol in Scotland and rent controls in New York. Non-profit maximizing motives are also a reason why we get market disequilibria. Some businesses may feel that they have a responsibility towards the community, and therefore keep their prices low even if that causes shortages. Examples of these include landlords not increasing rent in the face of high demand for rental housing, or food stall owners keeping their prices low because they know that the local community benefits from cheap, nutritious food. Sticky prices are also a major factor. Some firms may be committed to keeping their prices the same throughout the year, despite potential seasonal shifts in supply and demand. This could be because it would take too much time, effort, and money to change prices regularly. Therefore, if there is a sudden increase in demand for a good, maybe because that good becomes the latest trend very quickly, there may be shortages of that good in the short term because of this time lag between the demand shift and the price increase. We've reached the end of the video now. Here's a related news article on how the concepts of market equilibrium and market disequilibrium apply to the housing market. Thank you very much for listening.